I've always preferred to keep to myself at work. I'm not the type to hang out by the water cooler or chat about weekend plans with my coworkers. I just come in, do my job, and leave. It's not that I dislike anyone here. I just like my space. The office isn't exactly exciting, but it's comfortable. I've been working here for almost 2 years now, and nothing really out of the ordinary has ever happened. Until a few weeks ago. It started small. One morning I came in to find a cup of coffee on my desk. I don't drink coffee. I asked around, but no one claimed it. I shrugged it off and got to work. The next day there was another cup. This time there was a note attached. It said, "Have a good day." No signature, no explanation. Just that. I'll admit it was a little strange, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone was trying to be nice. Maybe it was a secret office game I didn't know about. Either way, I tossed the coffee and went on with my day. The gifts didn't stop. Every morning, something new would be waiting for me on my desk. Sometimes it was a snack. Other times, a small trinket like a keychain or a bookmark. Always with the same note attached. "Have a good day." At first, it seemed harmless. Just a secret admirer or some weird office prank. But as the days went on, the gifts became more personal. One day there was a book, a specific book one had mentioned to a coworker months ago. I hadn't told anyone else about it. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I asked around again. No one knew anything. Everyone just shrugged or joked that I had a secret admirer. But that didn't explain how they knew things about me. Things I didn't talk about. A few days later, I decided to treat myself. It had been a stressful week, and I hadn't been sleeping well. The strange feeling of being watched never left me. So I went through the drive-thru at a local coffee shop, hoping that a little caffeine would help me shake off the anxiety. I ordered my usual. When I pulled up to the window, the cashier smiled at me and told me my coffee was already paid for. I blinked and asked if there was some sort of generosity train going on today. She just shrugged and said it happens every now and then. I thanked her, feeling a small sense of relief. Maybe not everything was so weird after all. People were just being kind, right? But then I glanced at the cup. There was a small, familiar-looking note stuck to the side. My stomach dropped as I peeled it off. It said, "Have a good day." I froze. The words felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a random act of kindness, it was him. Somehow he knew I'd be there. He'd paid for my coffee. He was still watching me. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. How did he know where I'd be? How long had he been following me? I didn't have any answers, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every sound in my apartment felt amplified. I kept telling myself it was just my paranoia. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I woke up around 2 a.m. groggy and confused. My head felt heavy, my vision blurry. There was a noise, a sharp click like something snapping. I sat up in bed, looking around, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me up. For a second, everything was still, too still. Then I heard it again. Another sound, this time from the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed and crept toward the door. The apartment was dark, but the front door was wide open. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. I always did. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hands shook as I slowly reached for the doorknob, locking it again with a soft click. I searched the apartment, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry. No one inside. It didn't make sense. The next morning I called the police. They came by, checked the apartment, but didn't find anything. No signs of a break-in. No footprints. Nothing. I must have left the door unlocked, they said. Maybe it was the wind. But I knew better. I knew someone had been inside. I just didn't know who. Things didn't stop there. The gifts kept appearing on my desk at work, just as they had before. The same notes. Have a good day. I didn't want to believe the two things were connected. I tried to ignore the growing paranoia, but I couldn't. I stopped sleeping through the night, jumping at every sound in the apartment. A few nights later, I stayed late at the office. I had been avoiding working after hours, but I was behind on a project. It was almost midnight when I heard someone moving outside my cubicle. I assumed it was the janitor or someone from the cleaning crew. But then I saw him. The man I'd caught glimpses of before. The one who had been leaving the gifts. He walked past my cubicle, carrying something in his hand. My pulse quickened as I crouched down, peeking over the edge of my desk. He stopped in front of my workspace, looking around to make sure no one was watching. Then he placed a small box on my desk, just like he had done so many times before. But this time something was different. The box wasn't just another trinket or book. I waited until he left, my hands trembling as I reached for the box. I lifted the lid, and my heart sank. Inside the box was a small photo frame, and inside the frame was a picture of me, sleeping. My mind raced as I stared at the image. The pieces finally started coming together. That night, the sound that woke me up. The open door, the snapping noise. He had been in my apartment. He had taken this picture while I slept. The next day, I went straight to HR. I needed answers. I needed to know who this man was. I told the HR manager about the incident, describing the man in as much detail as I could. She frowned, confused, and said she'd check the records. After a few minutes of digging, she pulled up the names and photos of all the night staff and maintenance workers. None of them matched the man I had seen. She said, "He doesn't work here. We don't have anyone by that description." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. How had he gotten into the building? How had he been leaving the gifts on my desk for weeks without anyone noticing? I realized the horrifying truth. He had never worked here. He had been following me for much longer than I realized, watching, waiting. That night I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed a small bag and left, booking a room at a hotel across town. I thought it would be safer. I thought I could finally get some sleep without the fear hanging over me. But I was wrong. Around midnight my phone buzzed. I didn't want to check it, but I couldn't ignore it either. With trembling hands I opened the message. It said, "Room 217. Have a good day." My heart dropped. That was my room. How did he know? How was this even possible? I rushed to the door, my mind screaming for me to leave, to get out. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. Silence stretched out before me. No one was there. No footsteps, no sign of movement. I backed into the room, locking the door, every nerve in my body on edge. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. He was here. Somehow he had found me again. That's when I heard the floorboards creak. From inside the hotel room, I grabbed my bag, fumbling with the zipper as I headed for the door. My hands were shaking so badly, it felt like the key card was slipping right out of my fingers. I was almost there, almost free when the door creaked open in front of me. He was standing there. The man from the office, the man from the photo, the man who had been following me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. He stepped into the room, blocking my only exit. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, trying to keep distance between us. I asked him what he wanted, my voice trembling, but he didn't answer. He just took a step closer, and I knew I had to act fast. I threw my bag at him and made a run for the hallway. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps pounding behind mine. I raced down the hall, barely managing to stay ahead of him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst into the lobby, my eyes darting around for help. The hotel staff saw me, and their eyes went wide when they noticed the man right behind me. I shouted for help, and they didn't hesitate. The manager grabbed the phone and called the police. The stalker stopped dead in his tracks, realizing he had been caught. He turned, trying to make a break for the exit, but the police arrived within minutes. They cornered him outside the hotel, tackled him to the ground, and cuffed him before he could slip away. I stood in the lobby, gasping for breath, watching as they took him away. One of the officers told me he was a maintenance worker. He had been working in my apartment building for months, probably since the day I moved in. He had access to my building, my apartment, my life. That's how he had been watching me all this time. He had used his position to sneak in and leave those gifts, to follow me without anyone suspecting him. The police assured me that he was going to jail for a long time. But even as they said it, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling into my bones. He was gone, taken away. But that didn't change the fact that he had been inside my home, watching me for who knows how long. I thought about all the times I had come home, thinking I was alone, when in reality I had been anything but. He knew my routines, my habits, everything about me. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I moved out of my apartment the next day. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened, but the fear didn't leave with him. No matter where I went, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every time I looked out a window or walked down a dark hallway, I expected to see him standing there, waiting, watching. Even though I knew he was gone, the sense of safety I once had was shattered. I couldn't trust it anymore. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. I'm still trying to move on, trying to put the pieces of my life back together. But the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I've always been intrigued by creepy stories and enjoy listening to them. But never in a million years did I think that my life would become one. It all started with a text message I had just gotten home from work when I got the first one. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but it just said, "You looked beautiful today." I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone sent it to the wrong person. So I didn't reply. But then I got another one a few days later. "I saw you at the cafe today. I love the way you smile." I was starting to get creeped out. I hadn't been at a cafe that day, and no one should have been watching me that closely. I told Sophie, my best friend, about it, and she shrugged it off at first. She said it was probably some random guy who got my number and was just messing with me. But she offered to help me figure it out anyway. Sophie was like that, always wanting to be involved, always ready to dive into a mystery. A week later, things escalated. I found a note on my car windshield. It said, "You're even more beautiful up close." I could feel my skin crawl just reading it. Someone had been near my car, close enough to leave the note without me noticing. Sophie and I started trying to figure out who it could be. We made a list of suspects, people I interacted with regularly, classmates, coworkers, even some guys I had dated. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad thriller movie, but it was happening to me. The notes and texts kept coming. I started getting more paranoid every day. I would check my phone constantly, always expecting to see another message. I couldn't walk to my car without looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. Sophie stayed by my side the entire time. She was the one who insisted on walking with me to my car after work, the one who convinced me to install a new security system at my apartment. She even started sleeping over at my place on weekends to make sure I wasn't alone. It helped a little, but deep down I knew something was wrong. One night, after yet another creepy note appeared in my mailbox, Sophie suggested we confront one of the people on our suspect list. There was this guy from work, Dave, who had been acting weird lately. He always lingered a bit too long in conversations, always seemed to be around. It made sense to me he fit the profile. So we set up a plan. Sophie would come with me to confront him, ask him some pointed questions, and see if he would slip up. If he really was the one leaving the notes, we'd know. The next day, we cornered Dave in the break room. Sophie did most of the talking, asking him if he had noticed anything strange going on, if he knew anything about the notes. But Dave just looked confused. He had no idea what we were talking about, and honestly, I believed him. When we walked out of there, I felt like I was back at square one. Dave wasn't the guy, but that meant someone else was. The messages didn't stop. One morning I woke up to a text that said, "I'm closer than you think." I showed Sophie, and she looked just as freaked out as I felt. We decided to go to the police that day. But even after filing the report, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was going to change. Whoever this person was, they knew too much about me. They were always one step ahead. A few nights later, everything clicked into place. Sophie had been staying over at my apartment again. We were sitting on the couch watching some random movie when I realized I had left my phone in the kitchen. When I went to grab it, there was a notification on the screen, a new message. I didn't recognize the number, but it was a familiar message. My blood went cold. I stood there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been with Sophie the entire night. No one could have sent that message while we were together, unless it was her. I glanced back at the living room, where Sophie was still sitting, totally oblivious. My mind was racing. Could it be? I didn't want to believe it. But then I thought about everything. How she had always been there, always wanted to be involved. She was the one who convinced me to confront Dave, the one who always knew exactly when a new note or message had arrived. How had I not seen it sooner? I felt sick to my stomach. My best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone, had been the one stalking me all along. I went back into the living room, trying to act normal. I didn't know what to do. How could I confront her? What would she do if I did? I sat down next to her, and she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just tired. She smiled, that same easy smile she always had, and told me she was glad I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't stay in that apartment with her. I made up some excuse about needing to get something from my car, grabbed my keys, and bolted. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town, my mind racing the entire time. The next day, I went to the police again. I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first. Sophie had been the one helping me the whole time. How could she be the one behind it? But when they investigated her phone records, they found the messages. All of them. She had been sending them from a burner phone. The notes, the texts, everything. It had all been her. The obsession, the constant surveillance, it had been right under my nose the entire time. My best friend. The person I thought I could trust. Sophie was arrested. She never admitted to anything, but the evidence was clear. They found notebooks filled with details about me, what I liked, where I went, who I talked to. She had been tracking me for years, keeping notes on everything. I haven't spoken to her since. I've tried to move on, but the betrayal cuts deep. I don't trust people the way I used to. How could I? When the person closest to me had been the one haunting me all along? Every now and then I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, watching. I was never one to draw much attention to myself. In fact, I preferred blending into the background. School was no exception. I'd show up, sit in the back of the room, take notes, and leave as soon as the bell rang. That's how I liked it. No unnecessary attention, no drama. But everything changed when Mr. Owens, our regular history teacher, took a leave of absence. The substitute, Mr. Dalton, showed up the next day. At first, he seemed fine. Just another teacher filling in. He was younger than most of the other staff, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He had this friendly smile, the kind that made you feel like he wasn't all that different from us. The class didn't seem to care much. History was one of those subjects that most students just slept through anyway. I didn't pay him much attention at first. He started the lesson, going over some basic stuff about the American Revolution. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as the week went on, I started to notice something. He was paying attention to me. At first it was subtle. His eyes would linger on me a little longer than they did with the other students. During group discussions, he would always call on me, even if I hadn't raised my hand. He would ask questions about things I hadn't mentioned, books I was reading, my opinions on random topics, things I was sure I hadn't talked about in class. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just being overly friendly, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Then, one afternoon, things started getting stranger. I stayed after class to ask him a question about an assignment. As I was packing up my things to leave, he asked me if I liked history. I told him it wasn't my favorite subject, but it was okay. Then he asked me if I liked reading in my free time, mentioning a book one had been reading over the weekend. I froze. How did he know about that? I hadn't brought that book to school. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he had seen me at the library or something, but deep down I knew something was off. The next day there was a note on my desk. It wasn't from any of my classmates. There were no jokes or doodles like the usual stuff you'd see. It was a single piece of paper with 4 words written on it. I see you everywhere. My heart pounded as I stared at it. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice. No one was watching me. I crumpled the note up and shoved it in my bag, trying to focus on the lesson, but all I could think about was that note. That's when I started feeling like I was being watched, not just in class, but everywhere. Walking through the hall, sitting in the cafeteria, even when I was outside on the school grounds, I'd glance over my shoulder, and it felt like someone was always there, just out of sight. Mr. Dalton's behavior didn't help. He started asking me more personal questions about my hobbies, what I liked to do on weekends, even about my family. He was always friendly, never outright creepy, but the way he talked to me made my skin crawl. It was like he knew more about me than he should. A week later, the notes started showing up more often. I'd find them tucked into my locker, under my desk, even in my backpack. Each one was different, but they all had the same message: I see you everywhere. It was like whoever was writing them wanted me to know they were watching me, always. One afternoon, I decided to stay after class again, hoping to confront Mr. Dalton. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe this was all just some misunderstanding, but before I could say anything, he spoke first. He said, "I've noticed you seem a little distracted lately. Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell him the truth, to ask him if he knew anything about the notes, but something in his voice stopped me. Instead, I just nodded and told him I was fine. He smiled, that same friendly smile, and told me I could always talk to him if I needed to. That night, I found another note in my backpack. This time, it wasn't just a message. There was a photo. A picture of me, taken from a distance, standing outside my house. I stared at the picture, my hands shaking. I hadn't noticed anyone when the picture was taken. Whoever this person was, they had been close. Too close. I wanted to go to the principal. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But I didn't have proof. The notes weren't signed. The photo could have been taken by anyone. I didn't even know for sure if Mr. Dalton was behind it all. He seemed too normal. The breaking point came a few days later. It was after school, and I was walking to my car when I saw him. Mr. Dalton, standing across the parking lot, watching me. He wasn't smiling this time. He wasn't pretending to be the friendly substitute anymore. He just stood there, staring. I quickly got into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't help it. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched as I drove away. That night I found another note on my doorstep. This one was different. It didn't say anything. It was just a blank piece of paper with a single hand-drawn eye in the center. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning I went to the principal and told him everything. I handed over the notes, showed him the photo, and told him about Mr. Dalton's behavior. The principal promised to look into it, but part of me didn't believe anything would come of it. Mr. Dalton was too careful. Later that day, the principal called me into his office. He looked concerned, even a little shocked. He said, "We've spoken to Mr. Dalton, but there's something you should know. He doesn't work here." I stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean?" I asked. He explained that Mr. Dalton wasn't listed on any of their staff records. There was no substitute by that name. No one had hired him. He had never worked for the school. My blood ran cold. If he wasn't a teacher, then who was he? How had he managed to walk into our school every day, teaching our class, without anyone realizing something was wrong? The police got involved after that. They searched for him, but he was gone, just vanished. No one could find any trace of him. It was like he had never existed. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes when I'm walking alone or sitting by the window, I get the feeling that someone's watching me. I glance over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there with that same friendly smile. But he's never there. I started my blog a couple of years ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a space for me to write about my thoughts, share personal stories, and occasionally talk about books or movies I liked. It never blew up or anything, but I had a small, loyal group of followers who seemed to enjoy what I posted. For a while, it was just fun. I loved writing, and the feedback from readers made it worth the effort. It wasn't until about 6 months ago that things started to get weird. I remember the first time I received a comment that made me uncomfortable. It was on one of my more personal posts, something I had written about a difficult time I went through. The comment was from someone named Always Watching, and it wasn't like the usual responses I got. Most people would leave kind words or relate to what I was saying, but this one was different. "You're so brave for sharing that. It's like I can see your whole life through your words." That in itself wasn't too strange, but something about the phrasing unsettled me. It felt a little too personal, but I brushed it off. People could be awkward online sometimes. Maybe it was just an overly eager fan. But then the messages started. It began innocently enough. I'd get emails from readers every now and then, thanking me for my posts, asking for advice, or just talking about something I had written. But Always Watching took it a step further. They started sending me long, detailed messages. At first, it was flattery telling me how much they admired my writing, how they felt like they knew me through my posts. But the tone shifted quickly. They began referencing things I hadn't shared on the blog, little things about my personal life. At first, it was subtle, almost like they were guessing, mentioning places I might have been or books I might have read. But then it got more specific. One message said, "I saw you at the park yesterday. You looked so peaceful sitting on the bench, reading. I love that book, by the way." I stared at my screen, my stomach twisting into knots. I had been at the park yesterday. I had been sitting on that exact bench, reading that book. But I hadn't posted about it. I hadn't even mentioned it to anyone. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they had seen someone else who looked like me. It had to be a mistake. But the messages kept coming. Each one was more invasive than the last. They knew where I had been, what I had done, even what I was wearing. "That blue sweater looks really good on you. You looked so happy when you bought that coffee this morning." They were watching me. Somehow they knew things they shouldn't. Things I hadn't shared with anyone. I tried blocking the email address, but they found ways around it. New accounts, new usernames. Each time, the messages would find their way into my inbox. One day, I got home from work to find a package sitting on my doorstep. I wasn't expecting anything, so I figured it must have been delivered to the wrong address. But when I picked it up, I saw my name written on it. No return address. Just a simple, plain box with my name. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a book. The same one I had been reading at the park. There was a note tucked inside the cover. "You're even more interesting in person." I threw the book across the room, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. How did they know where I lived? How long had they been following me? I stopped updating the blog after that. I figured if I cut off the source, they'd lose interest. Maybe they'd move on to someone else. But it didn't stop. The next week I started getting text messages. They were short, always the same kind of message. "I miss reading your thoughts. Why don't you write anymore? Don't you miss me?" I changed my number, but it didn't matter. They found me again. I became paranoid. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of people watching me, following me down the street, but when I looked back, no one was there. The feeling of being followed never went away. Then came the night that everything escalated. I was in bed, trying to get some sleep after a particularly stressful day, when my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just a spam message or a late-night email, but then it buzzed again. And again, I picked up my phone, already dreading what I'd see. The message was from a new number. I opened it, and my heart stopped. It was a picture of me, sleeping. I shot up in bed, looking around the dark room, but there was no one there. The door was locked, the windows were closed. I hadn't heard anything, but the picture someone had taken it. Someone had been inside my house. I called the police immediately. They came, searched the place, but there was no sign of forced entry. No fingerprints, nothing. Whoever had taken that picture was gone, and they had left no trace behind. The police took the situation seriously, but without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to change my locks, install a security system, and be careful. But that wasn't enough. It wasn't going to stop them. I spent the next few days in a constant state of fear. I didn't leave the house. I barely slept. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind sent me into a panic. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next message, the next picture. The last message came a week later. It was simple, just a few words. I'm inside your head now. And then, nothing. The messages stopped. The emails, the packages, everything just stopped. For a while I thought it was over. Maybe they had lost interest, moved on. But the damage was done. The fear never left. Every time I step outside, I feel like I'm being watched. Every time I sit down to write, I wonder if they're still reading, still waiting. I never started the blog back up again. I don't know if I ever will, but every now and then, I check my email just to make sure. And sometimes I see a notification from a new account. A message I haven't opened yet, and I wonder if it's them. If they're still out there watching, waiting for me to let my guard down,